Hello, my name is Hamlet Dobbins, and this is Memphis Material, an oral history project chronicling the stories of the visual arts in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Material is a podcast celebrating the personal histories, the intimate stories, and the studio practices of some of the people who help shape the creative landscape of our city. These unedited interviews are all recorded at the Memphis Listening Lab, an archival gem located in the majestic Crosstown Concourse in beautiful Midtown Memphis. The archive and website are designed by the wonderful Brian Dixon. And we don't really have sponsors for this show, but if we did, one of the sponsors would be the long form podcast, or podcast in general. But the long form podcast is a wonderful resource for people to listen to the stories of reporters and writers who do long form journalism. It's a podcast that I reference all of the time with my friends and with my students. In part, it was sort of one of the impulses to do this. It's a wonderful resource. The long form podcast. They no longer put it out, but there is an archive of hundreds of episodes. And for me, one of the great things about that podcast is that they'll interview people more than once. So like, for example, I'm a big fan of Ta-Nehisi Coates and one of the main people who ran the long form podcast were good friends. And so whenever Ta-Nehisi Coates would have a new essay or a collection of essays or a book come out, he would go in and talk to the people there. And it's wonderful to sit down and listen to all of those interviews back to back, because you can really hear how Ta-Nehisi Coates' language not necessarily changes, but grows richer, how his thinking about his practice changes and gets better and stronger and more assertive. Anyway, it's a really wonderful resource. If you are into podcasts and you're listening to this one, the long form podcast would be right up your alley. Now, today's interview is part 2 of 2 interviews with the wonderful Melissa Dunn. And last week I mentioned that Melissa, and this interview with her was sort of a changing point in how I prepared people for coming in. And so there's a little blurb that I made that I send people that just kind of says, hey, I'm going to ask you this question, and then we're going to go from there. And how much you give me is totally up to you. If we run across anything that you don't want to talk about, you can wave it off. If you want, you can tell me beforehand that there are some topics that are off limits and that we don't talk about those. And so it was also, I think, really helpful to because at that point, I couldn't just say, oh, hey, here's the podcast website. You can go and listen to it. At this point, it was still an unnamed project where people would kind of come in and I would record these interviews and then I would send them a Dropbox link so that if they wanted to download it and keep it, they could. So I'm very thankful for Melissa for her feedback and her sincerity and her openness in this interview, in all things Melissa, paintings, conversations, food, all things. This interview was recorded on March 8th, 2024. Enjoy the interview. I'm just going to press the little button. All right. So what was the name of the place where you and Libby were living, the warehouse space here?
Well, it was called the Sad Pad.
Sad Pad, yeah. I was trying to remember what it was called when I was walking in.
Libby didn't live there. But she was there a lot. The people who lived there were Mark Gooch and Roy Berry, who's the drummer for Lucero. And he was actually learning how to play drums in this space when I was living there. So, and we made him a little trophy after a while, going Best Improved Drummer Award, because he was obviously he was probably in his early 20s, but, he turned out to be this, genius drummer that just blossomed and, which kind of made me think about those people, that whole scene in the 90s in Memphis, of the artists slash musicians that I was hanging out with, everybody seemed to have some level of arrested development of some kind. A lot of them came from, hang on, came from, homes where they kind of had to fend for themselves, or they weren't getting any kind of financial support, or, it was just a bunch of young 20-somethings who later in life I would go on to meet people who, oh, that's how you raise a kid, or that's what early 20s or 20s is supposed to look like when you have parental support and you have like family, like a family support system around you. But I feel like that whole Memphis music slash art scene that I was involved in was a bunch of young people who kind of made their own found family, the chosen family.
Okay, now just to sort of like make sure that I'm right in my timeline here. So you've gone to Chicago, you've moved back, you're living at the Sad Pad with these people. Now, where was the Sad Pad?
It was across the street from the Commercial Appeal, directly across the street. And actually, so it's like that whole area has been built up now. But at the time, Larry Block owned all of it. And I think that little row of those two warehouses behind, there's like a little strip of stores on Union, and then right behind it is where it's an alley, and that's where those warehouses are. And I think they're still dilapidated. They're kind of sandwiched in between Martial Arts and Union. I don't think that they've fixed them up or gentrified them or anything. Mark Nowell was in one of them, and his shop was there for years and years. Did you ever go to his shop over there? That's where it was.
Now, wait,
right next door.
He was there when you were there?
He was. So I had just met him. Him and Mark Gooch had gone to Art Academy together, MCA, and Mark Gooch played in that band I was telling you about, the Odd Jobs. So it was that whole scene. So I came home, and Mark and I had become really good friends. And I moved in. My parents were not happy about me moving in there at all. I mean, they were really, really opposed to it. But I did it anyway. And, it was just me and like 4 guys. And it was almost squatting. I mean, during the one time we did lose power in the winter, and we were like running extension cords and stuff like that. But I started playing music with those guys, and I had a little room in the back, and I would make art. And of course, Mark was a artist, and he was a sculptor, and he was making stuff, and he was doing all these installations on the roof. And Mark now was next door doing metal, and then Libby started coming around because she was friends with. There was this whole group of people that just started coming around and hanging out, and she and I became really good friends. And it was a really, I think I may have lived there for like a year and a half.
Now, what year was that, do you think?
91.
Okay.
91 or 92, something like that, early 90s.
Now, at that point, were you going back to school at the U of M?
I don't think I really went back to school until about 93 or 94. What I did was I was working for my dad. So my dad was... he had over there on Dudley, which is the street that Elmwood Cemetery is on. Mm-hmm. He bought he was a lighting manufacturer's rep. He was like a salesman for years and years and years. And finally, he bought one of the manufacturers he represented, and it was already had a shop. It was basically a sheet metal shop, and so he bought the business. There was like 10 employees, and I started working there and building light fixtures, and I would walk from the Sad Pad to Dudley every day, back and forth. So it's a 25-minute walk. I would go in and I would wire light fixtures, strip wire, cut sheet metal, and I worked there for 9 years in that warehouse with mostly women who taught me how to work. Those women taught me how to work.
Now, you were talking about how when you came back and you were at the Sad Pad, you had a space to make paintings or to make art.
Yeah.
What kind of stuff were you making there?
Well, so when I was in Chicago, and then those that I would say like, I guess that was like seems like it was actually kind of a long time, like 6 years of me just working jobs and just quietly learning how to make art on my own, developing my own ideas. And I was very shy about it, very private about it. And I had more ideas in my, but not enough dexterity to pull it off. So I think I spent years and years trying to get the dexterity and the ideas to level up and match. And so I was just making like little paintings and little drawings out of my imagination, but they were not abstract. They were like figurative, and they were sort of fantastical and surreal. And, you know, I was looking at a lot of the people that, people that young women in their early 20s trying to figure out their, like Frida Kahlo and things like that.
Now, what was it that was interesting about? I mean, Frida Kahlo is interesting,
Yeah,
period.
yeah.
But what was it that drew you to her in particular?
Well, I think all of the surrealist, well, she's not surrealism, but she kind of has a surrealistic bent. But I really liked the surrealist, and I really liked, what drew me to them is that you have a reality that you see, and then there's another reality butting up against it that you see an interior reality, and that they were psychological paintings. And I think even now my work is psychological. Like what I do is psychological paintings, and so I think that's really what it was. It was like it was depicting an interior world.
Now, who else were you looking at? I mean, you mentioned you were like some other people that most female painters who sort of look at art are thinking about at that time. And so you mentioned Frida Kahlo, and then who else were you thinking about, or what else was interesting to you?
I think everything was just like a fire hose. Like I was just absorbing everything, around me. And so I would go to the library and just get a stack of books. And it was just, I took some studio classes, and I took a couple of art history classes, and I got a foundation. I feel like I basically went to college for foundational work, and then the rest I'm sort of self-taught in a way. And so I would look at I was learning art history basically. So I was piecing together pieces and part of art history alongside piecing together American history and European history. So I would be looking at like a Calder book, and then figuring out where he was in relation to something else, and then someone else, and then I was like, oh, and then I would do things like, okay, so if in 1890, Van Gogh was doing this, that's when Marx was dead. But in America, so what fascinated me was relationships between different overlapping ideas, and I was learning on my own, teaching myself like chronology and just how the world worked visually and historically. But that was all happening at the same time. Mm-hmm. And also, not to mention music, like the history of, contemporary music, basically. Like I was always listening to, stuff in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Like I'd listen to music all the time, and then go hear bands play, So it was just, and then so you meet people like Libby and Roy and Mark, and everybody comes to the table with their, you're your own algorithm, right? And so you come to the table and you say, tell me what you like. Those conversations of what are you into? Show me your bag of tricks. And it was so great, because everybody came to the table with a different bag of tricks.
Now, were those conversations happening there at the Sad Pad, or were they happening at art shows? Were they happening elsewhere? Where were those conversations happening?
Well, they were happening everywhere. It was like everybody seemed to have there are a lot of people, like Libby was in school. Like some people were in school, some people had day jobs like me, but we'd get together at night and on the weekends, and then you just sit around, and it was just happening everywhere all the time. It was just like it was like you were just breathing it all the time. And I played music with two people that lived around the corner there, and that was my first real band I played in. It was Jack and Amy Adcock, and they it was called Larryland for Larry Blocks. He owned everything, and we would just hang out and listen to records and play music and play little shows at the Loose End, which is a little teeny tiny bar. Did you ever go to the Loose End?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was a big hangout, and we would play, and Alex Chilton was playing there then in this little bar, and that's where, it was a cool scene, it was a very cool scene. It was like I kind of bumped in between it was like kind of like in high school, like I just kept bumping in between scenes, like I would have this friend or that friend or this friend, and it was like I don't know, I've always been like that. But
now, thinking about the music that you were listening to at the time, like you were talking about hanging out with the people in Larryland and listening to albums, what kind of stuff were you listening to?
well, it was a combination between, I would say, 80s, 70s and 80s new wave and punk, British and American, and early Americana, like Woody Guthrie. And I was just discovering Bob Dylan, for example, and folk, because I never got into that when I was a kid, when I was listening to music growing up, I never listened to it. So discovering that, and then also, so it was a combination of like, we would, like Larry Land would play like a Woody Guthrie song and then like a 3-chord power, punk song. It would be like put on some kind of like banjo instrument, and then like play. So we were a hodgepodge. It was kind of postmodern in that way. I mean, I think I was just reading about David Solly. How do you say his last name? I was reading this old article about him and like 80s postmodernism. And I was like, yeah, I was very affected by that sort of Rauschenberg pastiche where everything got thrown in a pot and you got to kind of make your own thing, and I cut my teeth in that, and kind of came of age with that around me, and I've took full advantage of it subconsciously.
So you were there in the studio with Mark and Roy. Was that Roy Tamboli?
No, Roy Berry. He was
Roy Berry.
the drummer for Lucero.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, what about some of the things that were happening around town? In terms of visual art, was any of that influential or important?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think like how much, I felt like we would have little art shows, and I feel like that I kind of felt a little removed from that. I think I was mostly into the music part of it then, but then after I lived there for about a year and a half, then I moved in to next door to I became friends with Lori Godwin, who is Lorette Velvet. And she was playing with the Hellcats and the Panther Burns, and she was in that whole scene, okay? And so I had kind of met those guys, and when they came to Chicago, I would like play tambourine with them, that kind of thing. So I knew those women, and I was friends with them. But again, there I was on the periphery, like, hey, like got along with everybody, but then I go and do my own thing, And so Laurette and I became buddies, and she said, hey, listen, I live in this duplex in Cooper Young. Do you want to live on the other side? Moved out of this ad pad, moved over there. And I think that's when I kind of started taking class. I was still working for my dad, but I started taking classes at U of M again. And this would be like 93, 94. And I was really torn between doing art or doing history. And so I decided I'm going to take a sculpture class with Greeley Myatt, who's the brand new sculpture teacher there. And that's when I started meeting people like you. Were you there then? Like, when did you start?
I started in 88, but I started taking art classes in 89. and then I finished in 93, 94.
Okay, yeah. So there was an overlap, and then that whole scene, Ray Vonk, all those people, and Libby and everything. I was a few years older than everybody, but we all hung out, and so that's when Plan B was that the name, not that was in the pie factory, like that's. I clearly remember that being a watershed moment for me as far as like going to shows there, because I was like, oh wait, this isn't a high-low thing. This isn't something that's inaccessible to me. These are my people having a show in a sort of dilapidated-y kind of warehouse kind of vibe. And I mean, although I think even I may have had some work in a couple of those group shows. And that's when I started really feeling like, oh, I'm actually a part of a visual art community. I'm still very shy, still very like not talking about it very much, still maybe identifying more as a musician, not really knowing what I was. I had a day job and I was hanging out with cool people. I mean, that's kind of the way I thought, that's what life was happening. And then I was like, maybe I'll go back and finish my degree. Not at all thinking of practicalities, like, not at all thinking about what my future with an art degree or a history degree would bring. I knew that both of my interests would bring no money. So I wasn't thinking about career. I wasn't thinking about anything like that, I remember like when I was in college the first time, I was actually took some graphic design classes and thinking I was going to do graphic design. And even when there was this woman that was a graphic design teacher, she died of cancer. Sandy, gosh, I can't think of her name. She took a whole group of us to New York and we went to Milton Glazer's studio. This was back when I was in school the first time. I loved typography. I was really, really, really into graphic design. And I had this little fantasy. It was like, I'm going to live in Midtown in a bungalow and drive a Saab and have a graphic design studio. And then that kind of blew up. And then I started doing fine art. And then that little fantasy never came back. Like I never really, it went a whole nother direction. Like I just really thought in terms of like making and thinking and thinking and making. And that's where I was. Like I wanted to think and I wanted to make, And I thought I was just going to have a crappy job during the day to do it.
And it sounds like it was almost like it was this thing that you had started and you were sort of part of the way through. And I would imagine that there was probably a part of you that just kind of wanted to finish this thing that you had started and then also develop some of those skills. Now, when you went back in, when we met last time, you were kind of talking about how you kind of left mid-semester and things were sort of awry and your GPA was kind of bad. When you came back to school, usually what happens is students are really like, I'm going to do this and it's going to be this thing and I'm not going to half-ass it. I'm really going to push.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Yeah, straight A's.
Yeah.
I was all in. I stopped going out at night. Like I was not like I was probably 26 or 27 at that point. I was just like, I really just focused on the work. I became very dedicated. But so I took the sculpture class with Greeley. I think actually I ended up taking 2. And, I was okay. It wasn't like this epiphany of like, oh, wow, this is it. I found it. And, I did fine. And I actually made some pretty decent work in there. And of course, I loved the community. And Greeley was an amazing teacher. But.
Now, just out of curiosity. Dwell on that just for a second. Like, what do you remember about that class? What do you remember about Greeley?
I remember, Greeley kind of reminded me a lot of Larry in the sense of kind of a good old boy, intellectual good old boy. That combination of somebody who's got a thick Southern accent, who on the surface does not seem at all what they are, but beyond that, beyond first appearances and first impressions, because if you met them on the street, you would just sum them up as like, oh, that's just a Southern man, but you get to know them and they're like poetic and sensitive and deeply intellectual and very reflective and kind of people. And I just remember the thing that I was very interested with him was is that he just kind of kept moving forward. It's like we're going to make this thing, we're going to do this cast, we're going to do this thing, and then we're going to do this thing. And then it was just like this, and then and just this ability just to not dwell in something. Like if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then you just make another one. It's just like it's like let's underthink everything in a way. Like yes, we're going to think about things, we're going to have an intellectual component, and here is a slideshow about contemporary sculpture, and this is the history of contemporary sculpture. But at the same time, we need to learn these materials, make a lot of mistakes, and do the work. So I love the combination of those two things happening at one time. And that's what I do. I mean, I think that's kind of like if you go on and live a life in the arts, that's you're constantly battling materials and the work, and then the thinking and the processing and the feelings, and how you put those two things together. I think really, really beautifully did that. And I think a lot of those teachers up there were able to show me, oh, this is how you do that. Does that make sense?
And so you were saying you took a couple of classes from Greeley. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other classes that you remember taking when you came back to school?
I took a women in film. I took a philosophy class. So I was taking art classes, and then I started dipping my toe in liberal arts to see which way I wanted to go. And I think I took a history class. And it ends up that one of the professors in history was also like a very close friend of one of my dad's very good friends. So he was kind of like this sort of, he was in our world. Like I'd met, his name was Cale Mitchell, Kell. Mm-hmm. And he was a history professor. Vietnam was a big, 60s history, Vietnam history was a big thing for him. And he became my advisor eventually. And so it was good to have somebody in that department that I could sit down in his office, and I could say, I'm doing the art thing, I want to do the history, and just have somebody to talk to about it with. He was a really good guide. And so, but what happened was I started taking these other classes, and I missed out on so much academically as a kid that, and obviously I was a smart child that just needed help. And I was at a point in my mid-20s that I started gaining executive function enough where I could have a course load and do homework and do critical thinking. And I was just a hungry person. And I needed to learn how to write. I needed to learn how to think. And I dove headlong into history.
You know, one of the things that I was really struck by re-listening to our interview from last time was you had sort of referenced your absorption and your spongeness a couple of times. And I remember we sort of like, I remember trying to sort of circle back to it to try and think about it. And of course you can't really answer that. But then like just now when you said how hungry you were, I mean, I think for sure that's a big part of it. I mean, I think to recognize a need for understanding, or to recognize a need for pulling things in, I think you have to sort of recognize your hunger. And I'm not sure if that's something that we can instill in the population. Selfishly, as a teacher, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so how do I make my students hungry? You know, how do I do that? Or how can I help them? Or how can I foster their hunger? And I'm not totally sure if that's something that everybody has. And I feel like yours has been strong. And I think one of the things we talked a little bit about before we started today was how well you have become at understanding yourself, but also thinking about how that hunger is still very present, but in a productive way. You know, like I think in some ways hunger can be unproductive, it can be destructive, but I think in the way that you're approaching it, in the way that you're approaching, your paintings and the way that you're approaching this desire to learn and this need to learn, to me feels really productive and really strong. And it seems like that, of all of the things that we've talked about so far, for sure, that's a thing that pops out to me as kind of being highlighted. And I'm curious. I wonder what it was about you coming back to town. Do you think it was the trauma of like moving back and, like you went away to the big city and then you came back? Like, do you feel like that was maybe an impetus for some of that hunger recognition? Like you were saying, you came back and you were like, you totally wanted to do it. I wonder what it was that activated that hunger.
Oh, wow. Well, I don't really know. So I think some of this stuff is some people have a more curious, maybe curiosity is a better word than hunger, but and I do think that if you are going to live a life in art, and continue to filter your existence through a visual means, you have to remain curious, or any kind of art, for that matter, music, writing, whatever. Even now, like, I have to do things all the time to inspire my sense of awe, my sense of curiosity, because the older I get, sometimes it gets a little numb. I get a little numb and overwhelmed, and I can see why people stop, because it's easy to stop being curious. When you're in your 20s, it's a lot easier. You're just so, I don't know what that was about or where it was, but I just know that I was a very, very, like, highly energized person. Like, I had a lot, like, I loved to dance, and I loved playing in bands, and I was kind of wild, to be honest. Like, there was a lot of, I had to temper it with, like, I was like a lot of partying and all of that, like, and all that energy. And I don't know where it came from, or I just think that what happened was I had all of this energy in me, all this fire, and it was just spewing everywhere. There was no way I did not know how to take all that energy and just put it into a laser beam. That's been like the last 30 years. Now that energy is dense and sharp and directed, and it's like I got a quiver on my back and I pull out that arrow and I'm like that. But when I was in my 20s, I was just a clusterfuck bomb going off all the time. And it's taken years and years and years to take that energy and contain it. As far as, like, I think showing students and showing young people, and even though I don't have children and even though I don't teach young people, I do interact occasionally with people who are students and or younger, and, like, I have nephews and stuff, and my mantra is let your life speak. Let your life speak. They are looking at you saying, how do you do this life thing? And you being, this old person in their eyes, or this, this middle-aged person, and it's like, oh, you're not the same as everybody else. Like, I remember the first time I met an adult who was a thinker, because nobody in my family read books, or extended family. Nobody was contemplative. I mean, it's fine. I mean, it's just what it was. It's where it came from. And I remember that when I was in Chicago, hanging out with my friend Catherine Irwin, who played in that band Freakwater I was telling you about. And we went to her mom's house in Louisville, and it was just full of books. And she was doing on the front lines of social justice causes. She was a reader. She was a thinker. And I just could not I wanted to hang out with her all the time. I just wanted to sit at that table in her kitchen, drink coffee, and talk to this woman. And so I do feel like that I don't know if you can pull that out of people, but what you can do is set an example for people to see, oh, this is how you do it. And I think Greeley and Larry and all those people, that's exactly what they were doing. They never said, this is how you be curious. They just showed, this is how I remain curious, and this is how I do it. And I'm going to give you a few examples. I'll give you an assignment. I'll show you some art history, and I'll give you the materials. But the rest is the rest, and that's up to you. So I think that whole idea of let your life speak is like, that's the greatest gift a teacher can give a kid.
Man, that was such a perfect segue. That was really good. A great circle back. You're like a master at that. You were like, we're way over here, and then we're like, and that's exactly what Greeley and Larry and all those other people did. And thinking about that time in your life when you were coming back, was your interest in music as intense as your interest in terms of playing music, like you were talking about, playing with the with Larry World, Larry Land, and so talk a little bit more. I'm curious about the music and how that music intensity, because it seems like from an outside observer, someone who doesn't play music, looking at people who play music, it's such a different thing. It's similar in that it's creative, but also you're in front of people. There's a real risk of messing up, or there's a real risk of, something going awry. But then there's also this kind of immediate feedback. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about that intensity when you came back to town, and maybe how that translated not just in the visual arts, but also in performing.
Well, luckily, the music lent itself to being very, very scrappy. Mm-hmm. And so that was the aesthetic was scrappy. So I could just be I didn't have to be that proficient in order to pull it off, which allowed me to do it, basically. And so, because I wasn't that great. I was decent, I was just decent enough. I still am, I'm just and I didn't really practice that much. And I practiced a little, and, but, you didn't really have to. It was more about the show. It was more about the performance. It was more about the scene. And it was, to me, that's what it was more about. It was more performance art. To me, I think music has always kind of been a form of performance art. It's just you put on a persona and you're doing a thing. And, but at that time, soon after, I was living next door to Lorette, and I'm in that little house that we lived in, Alex Children was hanging out a whole lot because her and Alex were big buddies, and we'd sit on the porch, and there was a lot of music happening around, especially with Lorette. It was the proximity of being near her meant I was near a lot of musicians, even more than I already was. And then she became, she had been playing in that band, the Hellcats, and then she got a solo deal with a German record label out of Munich, and was going to go on tour. And that's when she offered me to play rhythm guitar in her band. And she and I were actually taking, at this point I'd already changed my major and I was getting a history degree, and we were taking a history of anthropology class together. And we went up to the teacher afterwards and we said, we can't take our finals because we're going to go on a rock and roll tour in Europe. And he was like, that's great. He was so excited for us. And so we took it after, and this is kind of a humble brag, okay? But that teacher, Dr. Frankel, did you know him?
He was my mom's boss.
Oh my God, what a mess.
Yeah.
Did you ever see his office?
Because he was all disheveled and yeah.
Oh my God, I'd never seen anything when I saw him walk into his office, I was like, it looked like somebody took a shop fan, one of those big giant, because we have this where I work, and put it in front of there and just blew all the papers everywhere 10 years ago. Nobody touched it. It was so crazy. But I was at a memorial service for somebody he happened to be there. This was 30 years later. He came up to me and he says, I have taught thousands and thousands of students, and I remember about 20 that are really prominent in my mind, and you're one of them. And that was the best for some kid who could not even get into the U of M and could not even test or get good grades until I was much older. To have that sort of validation as an adult was really, really good.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We'll talk about going to Munich.
Well, that was just life changing. I mean, that was like in '94. The wall was just down. Like, it's only been a few years. Not been that long, and it was it, I find for the first time I saw how the rest of another culture. It was like the first time I'd ever been out of the country, you know, and it was unreal. It was just like the unbelievable. And we ended up going 3 times over the course of 4 years. So each tour being about a month, like 27 shows in a month. I mean, and then I ended up becoming very close friends with a guy from Munich or outside of Munich, and went back and hung out with him for a few months. So I spent quite a bit of time there over the course of like 4 years, and it was unreal. I mean, in the sense that like even that first like when we land, like it was like 3 flights to get over there. It took no direct flights, so it was like a lot of travel. Got there, and this guy pulls up and says, "Your tour driver and tour manager has broken his arm. So I am your tour manager now. And I just graduated from architecture school. He's my buddy. I've never done this before. I ride a motorcycle, but I don't really drive a van. And my driving's not good, but my English is worse." And we're all like, okay. Well, it ends up we got this architectural tour of like we just every town we were in, we could get up. We would, if it were a little village, we'd go to the church, and he would explain like this was built in 1200, but that part was built in 1380. And he knew everything. And fast forward 20 years, and he was Macy Craddock's fiance. He came over. It was right after 9/11. He called me on the day of 9/11 as people came out of the woodwork, and calling each other. And I said, "Well, how are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm okay." He said, "I'm really dreading the Munich winter coming up." So what you should do is you should come over here in March, in February, and let's go down to New Orleans for Mardi Gras, because my friend Macy is like the best hostess in the world. And we'll stay with her, and we'll do Mardi Gras, and it'll be 65 degrees. And he did, and they fell in love. And they got engaged, but then sadly he passed away. But that's just a loop, just to put in there.
And so when you were there in Munich and you were talking about this architectural tour, I'm curious, what are some of the things that you came across that were important?
One time we were driving, and we had the cool thing is about touring in predominantly Germany and Austria and all those, those northern European countries is like everything's 4 or 5 hours away. So you kind of had a little time in each place. It wasn't like you had to drive, 12 hours, like you do in America. And so one time we were in the mountains, and Meinhardt, that was the driver, architect, and he said, he was driving along, and he looked at his watch, and he says, "I'm declaring mutiny. We are going to a church, and we're going to go to it, and that's what's happening." Like, no questions asked. And it was the first Rococo church ever built in Germany. And it had been getting rehabbed, like, for the last 10 years. Like, it was closed to the public. Like, they completely redid it. And I'd never seen anything it was like being on acid. It was, or some kind of, like, Willy Wonka meets Dr. Seuss. It was unbelievable. Like, it was like walking into the interior of a wedding cake. It was like, I couldn't believe, like, I was like, it was unbelievable.
One of my art history professors described Rococo as the William Shatner of art movements.
You shouldn't have said that when I took a sip of coffee.
I know. But that sounds really great. And it sounds like, one of the reasons I ask about the Munich trip is that I think if you had been 18 and gone to Munich, like, it would have been obviously a totally different story. Yeah. You going in your 20s when you're sort of on fire again, that experience, I'm sure, was totally different. Were you were you on the search for stopping in by the museum and seeing some of that stuff?
Yeah, we definitely were able to do some of that, but the just being in Europe was like being in a film set. I mean, I just would get full, get up and walk around. Well, for one thing, that you have to understand too is you could walk as a female anywhere, anytime, any hour, and that was like for the first time in my life, like that level of relaxation in my body I'd never felt, which was incredible. So that be the I loved the wandering and the roaming, and then also just we would play these little towns, and we played the bigger cities, but we played so many little villages that would have a government funded art center, that would have a ballet studio, a cafe where they'd have bands that they'd bring them from America, us. They, and then like 200 people from all around would come and to hear this rock and roll show. But then there'd be a metalsmith, there'd be a ballet studio, there'd be all the things. And it's just the government funding of the arts was the reason that we were able to do those trips.
When you were talking about that stuff, I mean, I was struck by a couple of things. One was remembering my time in Europe, and when I would come back, people would say like, "Oh, you've been in Rome, and so you're really into like Caravaggio and that kind of, or like Piero della Francesca. Like you're looking at that stuff, right?" And it was really not that at all. It was really about being in the city, and so that really reminded me of that. And then, of course, as a cis dude, that thing that you said about being able to walk around as a woman and feel safe and wander and roam really hits me, because that isn't necessarily something that's come up before in our conversation, but for sure it's a present thing. And it's interesting that you were talking about that time over there as being like you were relaxed and safe in your body. And I remember listening to the conversation that we had before where you were talking about being at Decadence Manor and about feeling, I remember you said something really great about like you felt your shoulders relax, and there was a kind of ease, and I'm not totally sure if I had a question at the end of that, but to me that's a really marked thing, something that feels really powerful. For sure, this is something we'll edit out because this is just me sort of talking. But I'm curious, what do you what was it like when you came back?
Well, it was sad. It was always very sad to come back because I was still working for my dad. I did not have much direction, and even though I had gone to college and gotten the history degree, and I was pretty angry at that time. I was dealing with a lot of anger, and like I didn't know who I was or what I wanted to do or where I fit, and I did not want to keep working for my dad because that was not a very healthy thing at all, and because it was pretty still combustible. It was kind of like that whole thing of like, the Arrested Development, in the sense of like I was still in that environment at 28. It was like I got to get out of this, and although I did learn a lot, I learned how to do a studio because I learned how to do production, and I learned how to work, and then I worked in the office, and so I did learn how to work, and I got a lot from that work experience, but it was a 7:00 in the morning to 3:00 in the afternoon kind of gig, and for years, and I was over it, and but it was hard to come back because I was directionless, and I didn't really have like another thing that was happening in that time. That was when I met Ira Sachs and did that movie The Delta, and Lorette and I ended up moving in together in Vecca in a 4-square, and we would have like Libby was our roommate. It was always the two of us, and then we'd have roving roommates. So my rent was $300 a month, or $280 a month for years, and I had a little studio off the kitchen that was like a little add-on room, And that was my sort of office studio. And then I had my bedroom. So I had 2 realms. And then I lived there for 7 years. And we lived together for a long time and played in bands together and toured together. She and I were very close. And Ira came over one night. He was in town. He was casting this movie he was making about being queer in Memphis in the 80s, Kim coming of age. And he walked in and he was like, I'm casting people. You should come audition. And it's all non-actors, and we're going to do improv, and we're going to write the script through the improv and all this. And they had a little production studio in a rented house on McLean. And we made the Delta, and it ended up getting in Sundance, and the rest is history. I mean, and that was an incredible, fortuitous meeting, because Ira and I are still very good friends, and it's, he's gone on, and we're still very good friends in the sense of, like, yes, he's making, he was just a judge at the biennial, the Berlin Film Festival, and yet we have conversations about the struggle of waking up and making things every day, which is beautiful to be able to, like to be able to have somebody, because he just had a film that did great, but the film before that, it was a disappointment in the sense that it didn't get the attention it deserved, and he's always struggling, and so there's hits and wins, and just to have those kinds of friends who you came of age with, who are still like you. I mean, like, we're still making stuff. Like, what does it mean to make? What is it making stuff over the course of a lifetime? So a lot of those people that I met then, there are a handful that we're still having the same conversations.
And you were talking about how important that was in terms of your relationship, your friendship with Ira. What was it like working on that project?
It was really okay. For one thing, I remember, so everybody in the movie was 18 or 19. And I was 28, but I was cast as an 18 or 19-year-old, which was cool. But it was also like, I wasn't hanging out with them so much. I was hanging out with Ira and the producer, Margot Bridger. And meeting Margot, I loved Ira. For one thing, the whole Memphis art scene and Memphis music scene of that time was very straight, okay? And so this was the first time I was really around a lot of queer people in a bigger context, like it was so, and it felt very comfortable and very good. And also, it was also still so homophobic. Oh my God. Like, some of the things, like, unbelievable. But, the Ira and Margot had gone to Yale, and I just remember sitting there having conversations with them, and we would, like, talk about books and literature and music and just everything. And I would think to myself, I mean, these people from Yale want to hang out with me. Like, my self-esteem was so low. It was so low. So I was still just that struggling kid in a way, So to have people where I could, it was, again, like meeting people who were different than what I was around and normally around, and to be able to have these discussions about art and life and everything else was, and like Margot had studied women's studies and done a lot of women's studies work, and I had too. And so to be able to, like, break all that down with somebody and to actually have conversations with somebody about it all, it was just incredible. But then also making these films. And then, of course, Ira's a cinephile. So we would just watch movies and talk movies and think about movies, and just a real education, and to see the production side of it, which I ended up doing a lot of movie production work later on in art departments and stuff for a while.
Well, I remember that being a part of your story. I think you were doing that when I knew you.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that you guys were looking at, thinking about, and talking about? Like, I'm curious about like when you were saying Ira was showing you a lot of movies. Like, I'm curious what you guys were looking at.
I mean, I honestly can't remember like a specific thing.
Like pop quiz.
Yeah, that's where I kind of get deer in the headlights. But just anything. Like, we would watch French films. We would watch, or he would recommend this or he'd recommend that, and also there was that. What was the name of that video store on Union? video. Gosh.
Midtown Video.
Yeah, but even before then, there was another one. I can't think of the name of it. But basically, I think by then it was Midtown Video. They had a great selection. Mm-hmm. And then there was Black Lodge. I can't remember when Black Lodge started. But you could, I spent, I say that I went out a lot and I did a lot of stuff and played in bands and stuff. Yes, but the one reason that I shifted back to art was I pretty quickly, like in my late 20s, realized I don't like going out. I don't like being in big groups of people. I don't like staying up late. When I lived with Lorette on Friday and Saturday nights, I was just like when I was a kid, home alone a lot, which was great because everybody would be out, And I would just rent movies and watch. I still do. I still watch tons of movies and TV. I mean, I love all that, And so, anyways, but mostly it was just the conversations of like being like, oh, I'm actually kind of like have an understanding of books and reading, and I don't know, it just flushed everything out. It was like that whole thing of coming to the table and being like, you show me your bag of tricks and I'll show you mine, and that everybody's is different. Things feel more homogenized now. I mean, because it is through algorithm that's trying to sell you stuff, so we're all seeing the same things in a way. And it's but when you have to be your own curator of your own cultural content, you become, I think that creates a you're not as bored, and so you actually you come up with something that truly is yours. It's like going back to what I was telling you about, like being in the library and pulling a Judy Chicago book out when I'm in high school, knowing nothing about art, nothing about feminism, but somehow it completely resonating with me. That's not going to happen in a scroll. I mean, it might a little bit, I do think that there's magic there. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying that I sure feel fortunate to have been able to come of age in a time where if you're a thinker and you're curious, you get to cobble together this sort of worldview, for better or for worse, that is more self-directed and less fed to you based on something trying to be sold. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's my rant.
That sounds good. And so I'm thinking about your studio practice and about the art production.
Yeah.
How do you think the art production, I mean, aside from, of course, it paid rent, but at what point did you move away from your dad's lighting fixtures into doing production?
I was actually making stuff all along. So, the one thing I will say is that I kind of...
And by production, I meant studio, not studio production, but film production stuff.
Oh, film production.
Yeah.
Gosh, okay. So I think that was more like in the early 2000s, like 2001 and 2002. I was working on, I quit my dad's and I did some waitressing. I did some temping. And I got a job at Alsac at St. Jude, mm-hmm. and I worked there like 3 days a week doing computers, just data entry. And I worked there for 7 years. But I would go back on, they ended up hiring me temp from November to March, which was their high donor season. And so I was going to get most of their donations, and I ended up training people. Like I ended up doing all kinds of stuff. I catered. I did hodgepodge together an income. Okay. And then I would also slip in there, a film production would happen, and the cool thing about working at Alsac was it was temp work at seasonal work. So I could just work around all these things. And I worked on the mural at St. Jude with, anyways, you can cut that out because I can't think of that guy's name. That's rude. But so, anyways, Claudio Perez Leon. We'll talk about that later because that is that actually, Claudio, what happened is I was working on that mural at St. Jude, and I had been inundated with childhood imagery, and that was in 2002, and that's when I decided to try abstraction, because I just wanted to get imagery out, because I was like painting all this like bushes and kids and all this stuff, and I was on that team of muralists. But I worked on 40 Shades of Blue, which was another Ira Sachs movie, and I worked on Walk the Line, and I worked on some oh boy, there was a lot. I mean, like, I'm just skimming the surface. Like, there was this guy from Detroit, Dan Rose, who was a big part of my life, of our lives at the time, me and Lorette. And there was this big Detroit, New York, Memphis connection where people would be coming through and bands would come through, and they would stay with us and get to know each other. And Dan was making all these music videos for people around town, and he was just incredible. And Iggy Pop had hired him to make a film to have shown behind him, and he pretty much made that in my little studio off the kitchen. And then he made this movie called Wayne County Ramblin' about this young Polish girl in Detroit coming down to North Mississippi, where her grandfather lived, and was living in a shack on Arthur Turner's property. And he said, I want you to be the production designer. And this was before, like, I actually started working in art departments. And I said, what's a production designer? And he goes, well, it's like the aesthetics of a movie. It's the way a movie looks. And I said, well, I've never done that. And he goes, yeah, but I love your art. And that's happened a bunch, where somebody will say, I want you to do this thing. I'm like, I don't know how to do that thing. And they're like, yeah, but you know how to do that thing. And that's and I trust that you can do this other thing because you can do that thing. That's, so.
So what'd you end up doing with this?
Well, so it was very low budget. And so it was mostly like a lot of thrift storing and a lot of, buying props and buying this and buying that and painting a wall or figuring out a scene and making a little set. Everything was just, and then he actually got Iggy Pop to commit for 2 days. And so Iggy Pop shot a scene with him in Detroit, like in 99. And then in 2001-ish, he came back to Memphis and shot one night in a field in Mississippi. And he did it through a dream. A dream sequence is the way he like connected the continuity. And so I was like doing all that, but then because it was so low budget, I was also the transpo person. So I was the one driving like a 16-person van of like full of people down to Mississippi, dropping them off, and then going to the airport and picking up Iggy Pop and driving him around for a whole day while he was here. It was the greatest thing ever, was to pick Iggy Pop up from the airport.
And there were a couple of things. I can't remember what it was. I was listening to our interview before, and I was like, oh, we could do a whole podcast series on Decadence Manor, or we could do a whole podcast series on the Antenna Club and the change from the dancing crew to the hardcore crew and how horrible that was for dancing. And now I'm like, well, I want to make a whole movie about this one day where Melissa drives Iggy Pop around. Wow. It's interesting, those things that are in there, that are a part of our lives and that function in that way. And I'm thinking about, for you, your studio practice, because if I remember right, we overlapped at martial arts at some point. When was it that you ended up having a studio there?
It was kind of around then, and the crazy thing about that is I did all that martial arts on a credit card. I like killed my credit from doing that because I didn't know any better. And I just wanted a studio so bad, and I split it with Macy Craddock because she lived in New Orleans, so it was like nothing. It was like $150. But I was like, I'm going to just do it for a year, and I'm going to put it on a credit card. Like, I don't know. But learned a big lesson on that one. But point being is that's when, I was still sort of thinking about these, like, looking at a lot of, like, Basquiat and that sort of 80s expressionism, and making these sort of collagey kind of paintings of different things. And I would build the work and build the work and build these backgrounds and build all the stuff, and then I kind of tack on an image here and there, but the image was always the afterthought. The fun part was building everything else. So when I did eventually do abstraction, it was like I'd already kind of been doing it, in a way. But having that studio there was very cathartic, because see, what happened was I had been living with Lorette for 7 years, and it was a great experience, and playing. We went on all these tours. We ended up going back 3 times, and all of it. It was awesome. But then it just was clear that like we were gonna move on into our lives. And I really wanted to live alone. And I found one of the last just cheap apartments in Midtown. And it was great. It was on the 2nd story of this apartment on McLean. And I completely stopped going out. I completely stopped, not that I was really hanging out with guys that much at the time. I mean, not to go into my romantic life, but let's just say I just took a vow of celibacy for 2 years. I was like, either we're going to date and you're going to be the dude that I'm going to really, really spend time with, and we're going to be very serious, or we're not doing it, I was like, I needed to a cleanse almost. And I did it, and that was soon after. That's when I met James. And that was in 2002, and you were still at martial arts. I think I had already left by then. And but yeah, so that was a period of a lot of people that sort of by then I was in my early, pushing my mid-30s. A lot of people had been going to graduate school, and that was when I was just really torn, because I was everybody around me was who was in the arts were going to graduate school, or people who were in, or in history, or in other fields, liberal arts, going to get PhDs, and people were doing their education, expanding their education. And I just was I just didn't want to do it. I just didn't want to be saddled with debt. The one thing I had was time. I mean, yeah, I had that little credit card debt, but I wanted time, and I wanted to have a low rent, and I just wanted to have a job where I worked 3 or 4 days a week so I could work in my studio. Because at that point I was like, okay, I'm not gonna pursue the music thing anymore, in the sense of not that I ever thought I'd be a professional musician, but I couldn't barely stay up past 9. I'm not going to do this, And also, and I did end up playing a little bit here and there. I played a bunch of solo in Harlem. Harlem Bobo would play with me and play instruments and stuff like that. But, and I would still go see music. I mean, that's when Jeff Buckley was playing down at, downtown Barristers. Did you go to those shows? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was at every single one of those shows, and I was just...
Me too.
It was unreal. Mm-hmm. And, so... And, he would come over and hang out. That was Laura, we'd all hang out. He was it was a great scene, But I also was really kind of feeling trying to find who I was as a person. And I was slowly starting to show work here and there. I'd have a group, I had a group show. I would show twice at Otherlands. I would do these little shows for myself so I could put together little bodies of work. And I'd be in group shows at Martial Arts and here and there and stuff like that. And then when I was living in that apartment on McLean and really kind of became hermetic and just was trying to find myself and all of that, I was I want to make a body of abstract paintings. And that's, at the time I was working 3 different jobs, doing this and that and the other. And it was kind of, James and I had just gotten together, and, when I met James, it was I always tell him, I always say I had a view of myself that was one thing, and you just saw straight through to the heart. And for the last 23 years, I've just been able to sort of blossom out of that, of what he saw. like the diamond in the rough kind of. Like he saw me for me, and it took a while for me to see what he saw, but he always saw it, and so yeah.
That's really beautiful. So you were talking about making the body of abstract paintings. What, just out of curiosity, knowing how thoughtful you are about so many things, at that time, I would imagine that you were aware that you were making a shift away from music into art. And what was it about abstraction, or what was it about your painting at the time that made you want to get rid of the stuff, the things, the chairs, the people?
I felt like that they were tag-ons. Like I felt like that they were just they weren't the thing that was making the work strong, and that there was a narrative there that was outside of that imagery. And also, the only thing I hardly ever looked at was abstraction. I was always pulled towards abstraction. I like to read about abstract painters. I like to think about abstraction, the history of abstraction, and I just felt like I trusted it, but I didn't know how to make it so other people could trust what I made. But yeah. And then soon after, like once I started making those paintings, that's when you came over and you were like, well, I'm starting this gallery. Why don't you have a show? And that was the first time like I put the abstraction like kind of out in the world.
Just out of curiosity, back up a little bit. What were some things that you were looking at and thinking about at the time?
Well, I'd always been, like I said before, like really interested in the Russian abstraction of the 20s, like just the basic shapes. And then I also really liked, it's funny because now I look at some of the stuff I looked at then and I'm like, yeah, I mean, I was obsessed with Gorky. Like now, not so much, but at the time I just was totally into.
Just because you're so thoughtful, what was it that brought you to Gorky? P.S. That's a horrible way for me to ask the question because now you're on the spot. Because you're so thoughtful, Melissa, what was it about Gorky? And so now you're like, well, shit, now I have to be really awesome. Okay, back up. Just out of curiosity, P.S. I never got Gorky. And so really I'm asking this question from the point of view
of... It is. I think everybody was. I realized everybody was obsessed with Gorky. Like he was there. He was the generation that like Mondrian and Gorky and all those guys were in New York when those abstract expressionists came up. So they were the elders. So if you're going to read about the history of abstraction and learn about it, you are also going to learn about those people, those players' adoration for that generation. So I think I was like thought I was supposed to like Gorky. I think what I liked about Gorky was the way that his colors. I don't know. There was something about the way that I just was forming my eye in a way. Like I was learning how to see and learning how to look at it. Some of it was like, also I'd had experiences like seeing a Joan Mitchell in person, gone to the de Kooning retrospective, I'd gone to, at that point, Margot Bridger, the woman who was the producer on that film, she had an apartment in New York, and I started going up there all the time and staying in her place and going to museums. And she was a lifelong New Yorker, and we would go all over Chelsea. Like that was when I really I was looking at Art Institute, but man, when I went to New York and hung out with Margot, we really dove in. And so I was able to see all this abstraction in person, and really get a sense of it and just get a sense of sort of the history of painting. And then of course, I don't know, I just, and then also I just couldn't get enough of Joan Mitchell, of course.
Now, what's interesting for me is like in the way that we were talking earlier about algorithms, there really is this algorithm of your favorite painter's favorite painter, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And so that idea of Gorky being, one of the people that came over to the United States from Europe, during that time, and then also like his activity as a teacher and as a kind of abstraction evangelist, and how that was really important. And for you, was because mostly what I'm hearing you talk about is once you moved out of martial arts and moved into your studio at home, there really was this kind of hermetic existence for you where you were painting and looking at stuff and thinking about stuff. And just out of curiosity, what about, were there conversations that were happening with you in the studio with other people? Were you seeing other things in the community that were really impactful or really important to you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, well, you and I had become friends. And I think that that was a big impact on me because you had just come back from Iowa. And, and that was, and just seeing the way that you painted and the way that you thought about painting and the way that you approached photography and documentation and chronology and personal narrative, but also like your work was just a impression of that. It wasn't like this is the story, but it's like if you want to know the story, there is another story here. And the fact that, so that was really a big deal. And then and then when you started curating at Rhodes and you started bringing in a lot of people, that those shows were very helpful for me. And like, I'll tell you that Jared Sprecher book he made of the brown, like that, you know what I'm talking about? I, for this show, that was like one of my primary sources. Like, I've been looking at that old Jared Sprecher's paintings a lot, and he's like a contemporary of ours, but at the time, if people still felt sort of like, I felt kind of an outsider. I felt kind of like my work's not good enough. I'm not good enough. And maybe I honestly, this is what I would get a lot at the time. Man, your work's getting really good. Or I see you really improving. There was a lot of like, keep at it, you're really getting there. Like people in the art community saw I was trying, like, and I don't get that anymore, but
Well, do you think that, like, it almost sounds like you're talking about,
never
like,
say that to anybody anymore. I will never say, even if I think it, I will never say that to a person.
Okay, so like part of me is also wondering, like, is that part of Melissa's revisionist memory? But I know what you're talking about. And so you were working away on McLean, and I remember the name of the show at Material. It was named after the apartment in the
38 North McLean.
Yeah. And that was our first show.
Yeah.
And that was like it's a thing that sort of lives in my story too. And I mean, I think for me, the thing that was so perfect about that was that when Julie and I were talking about that space and what we wanted that space to do, we really wanted that space to be a place for someone to have, where someone didn't have to have 20 slides to fill a space that was big like martial arts. And we wanted it to be a place where people could experiment. And we wanted for it to be a place where people could have their first solo show, or something to that effect. And so for me, that show was so perfect in that way. But also in terms of like me, when I think about the work in that show, I think it's a place where I also selfishly was able to live with art, and where I would come down to the studio every day and see these pieces, and I think for me, one of the things that I always both liked and disliked about your work is that there's so much new stuff, and there's so much new stuff kind of coming together, like when you mention, all of your disparate sources, like you're really talking about a lot of people that I don't like, like you're talking about Gorky, or, you mentioned Calder and like a couple of other people. I'm like, God, Melissa, I don't like those people at all, And for me, one of the things that I like about your work is that it is work that doesn't have to be lived with, but it rewards you for living with it and seeing it more and more. It's like that when we were talking about Jeff Buckley. Like, I remember listening to that Jeff Buckley Grace the first time, and I was like, what is this? But after I listened to it a dozen times, I didn't want to listen to anything else.
Yeah.
And I think that is such a difficult thing for us as visual artists, because like it's not often that we get that second glance. It's like we have to kind of like, our perseverance is the thing that makes us last, in terms of making people look at it again and see it again. But for me, like, thinking about that show of yours that was there, for sure it was this wonderful thing where I could see this work that was problematic in my brain, but then I could see my internal metronome slowly adjust to your rhythm, and I could have this kind of, as I would go by it every day on the way to the studio, I would see it and I would think about it, and things that didn't make sense the first time I saw them started to make more and more sense, and then everything else started to sort of fit into place. And I think that's, for me, one of the things that was so pivotal, and one of the reasons we kept doing those shows was that I was able to be around that art, and that my kids were able to be around that art. And for me, that was a really important facet to my life. But I'm curious, for you, that show at Material, I'm curious how that worked for you. I mean, obviously that was kind of a one-sided understanding of that show, but I'm curious what that show was for you.
Wow. I mean, I think that show, and then we did a show a few years later, too. I think they kind of blur into one in my mind, Uh, I think I'm still making the same body of work. I think I'm still making that body of work. I mean, in a way, like, in the sense that what I was thinking about and trying to figure out and trying to put together and piece together and how to build a painting and make a painting, um, and you know, I'm I can look at work that I make now and put it right next to some of that work, and you might not know that they weren't made 20 years apart, which is both something I'm self-conscious about, and I think is also badass. Like, I'm having mixed emotions about that, about what it means to polish a stone, what it means to spend a life thinking about. Now that I'm reading more and more, I've been doing a lot of reading about artists in their 70s lately, and I'm seeing a lot of people saying that's what we do, that is our job, you know. But I feel very close to that work, and still think about it all the time. It was the thing that I don't know. I think when I started making abstraction is when I started feeling affection towards my work and befriending it in a way that was like I wasn't battling it so much. I mean, it's still a battle. I mean, even now, but the battle isn't the outcome. The battle is the process. Once the painting is done or the drawing's done and it's up and it's looking, even if it's problematic and it's not resolved or maybe not, I'm still sort of tender towards it. And I think that was a result of that too. And also I feel like that was the first I mean, honestly, yeah, I had been showing and had like my CV probably starts in like 92 or something, but I feel like that show was really the first show in a way, of what it as a mature artist. And I was 37, when that happened.
Well, I'm curious, like as you were talking about that, I was thinking about how you were talking about having an old painting next to a new painting and how they could be connected and be with one another. And to me, that seems like it's really powerful and really interesting. And I also know that you live with a lot of your paintings. You'll have them in the house. And if I remember right, one of the paintings that was up at your place the last time I was there was one of the paintings that was in that second show at Material. And I'm curious, I mean, it's a total side note, but I'm super curious, what do you think it is that that happens when you have those paintings around? Because that was 20, not quite 20 years, yeah, 20 years ago.
Well, they teach me, you know. I they just the art, the work itself is a part of me that is more evolved and wiser and smarter and less reactionary, and is the best part of myself, you know? So when I see my artwork, what's reflecting back to me is something very positive, you know? So that's psychologically, like emotionally, that's what I learned. But then I also learn about, you know, what it is my tropic gestures are over the course of a lifetime. You know, what mark am I making over and over and over again? How am I thinking about this color and that color? And how am I piecing together and building together this work? And what's happening now is when I make art, because I do familiarize myself with my archive and I look it in the eye in such a very active way, is that I will be making work and I'll be like, oh, that's that thing. I remember doing this. I've done this before. I've been here before. It's a deja vu. And I love that. I love it when that happens. And it happens all the time, you know? Like there was a painting that was in that show and I just couldn't stand it for years and had it in my racks. And then I pulled it out. I was like, this is a great painting, you know? But I do have a few paintings in my rack right now where I'm like, that was not a successful painting when I made it. I kind of knew it wasn't a successful painting. It has not grown I have not grown to love it in this way that I have some that I thought were not that great. And I think I'm going to take them off the stretcher frames and roll them up and reuse the stretcher frames. I mean, some people are like, I'll just tear a painting up or I'll destroy it. And not, I don't really do that. But so for me to take something off a stretcher frame and roll it up is a pretty big deal.
Right. And now what I'm thinking about now is sometimes it's hard for me to make questions that are take all this stuff and put it into question form. So when you had that show at Material, like I remember that it was also an energizing thing in your practice. And I also remember there being a lot of people who had not seen that work and people who were really interested in it. And there was an excitement about that show and about the work. And I don't think it was just about the new space. I think it was about the work. And I'm curious, you know, and of course you've got the show that's up right now. What are some things that happen for you in terms of putting a show up and then moving forward? How does that work in your practice?
Well, back then 20 years ago, I was so much more insecure. I was real afraid. I was real guided by fear, you know, and that was my driving engine.
What were you afraid of?
I was afraid of what other people thought. I really cared about what other people thought, and I really wanted, you know, I really wanted to be in David Luss Gallery. You know, I really wanted the things that everybody else was getting, you know, and or I really wanted to, like, do I go to grad school? Do I don't go to grad school? How do I do this art? If I'm going to do this thing, how do I do it? And I was looking at all the models around me, right? And who was doing what and how it was quote unquote done. And I was pushing 40, you know, and I was like, there was a lot, like, I was like, I didn't know, like, so I was like very confused in some ways, but I still showed up and deadlines would happen, and so I would just put all those insecurities aside a bit and just make the work, then put it out, and then be like, hustle, hustle, hustle. What's the next thing? What do I do next? And now, when like now I'm in a completely different because now I'm like, I'm lucky if I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning. you know, I mean, I have a sense of that time is extremely precious, and that is a complete waste of time thinking about what other people think, thinking about your quote unquote career, thinking about selling, thinking about anything that has anything to do with beyond what's happening between you and the thing that's trying to work its way through you and get out. Then anything that you put in that way is on you. And I, through a lot of work, have figured out, and it's a continuous daily practice. I'm not going to say I've figured it out, but what I've figured it out is that it's a daily practice. Mm-hmm. To get out of my own way and just to be like, all right, come on, let's do this thing, and let the work actually pour through me and let it come out. And only person I'm trying to satisfy is me. The only metric is, do I like it? Because I have no control over how anybody else is going to take it. I have no control over how it's going to measure into the greater art world. Or if it is, I feel like I know that I'm part of American contemporary painting. I mean, I feel that because I look at it, I think about it, I live it and swim in it. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm ever going to have a show in New York. That means that you might end up having an art sale of my work when I die, and people come and get it, and somebody gessos over it for their art class. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm not concerned about legacy. I'm just only concerned about, like, can I get out of my own way so this work can pour through me so it can get made? Now, luckily, I get a show here and there, Luckily, this new gallery's opened up, and I've got a show on a calendar 2 years from now. That's all I've ever wanted, was a calendar. Mm-hmm. Because then I can go away and quietly do what I do. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, it's constant work to keep my head and my spirit in a place that allows me to make the work. It's like I cannot do it if I'm emotionally distraught or if I'm physically not in a good place. Like, it's a lot of work to keep my head clear. Like, one of my favorite books is that Letters of Van Gogh to his brother. And he says explicitly, if I'm, he had epilepsy. We know what he had now. But at the time, he just thought he was just a lunatic. Like, when I'm having an episode, he would call it, I can't work. Like, we all think that Van Gogh was somebody who was making this work out of madness. But actually, when he was actually in the throes of his condition, he could not work, and I can't either. I mean, I can't. I mean, I can do a little drawing or do a little this. I mean, I can do some things, pick up the guitar and play it or sing a song. But that's just medicine. To create something and build a body of work, and it's like moving a mountain. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm preaching.
No, I'm totally okay with you preaching. You were talking about your practice and your routine. I'm curious, what are some things that have been a part of your routine that have helped you in the studio?
Well, I need a lot of quiet, so I do a lot of meditation, and anytime I can, like, quiet down and really be actually quiet, either with myself or other people, I love, that's kind of my favorite thing. I exercise. I have to exercise a ridiculous amount.
I know it's so funny. Like when I ask this question, like there's a part of me that is saying, what are the basic things, you know? And
Right.
and of course, when you answer it, it's like, well, duh, I have to eat right, I have to exercise,
No,
I
but
have to
it's so,
meditate.
yeah.
But like, I really think that each person kind of has their own particular thing, and like I was saying before about your practice and your time, like I'm curious, how was it that you came to understand these things? And it sounds like, in terms of me thinking about that, your quiet and your time alone really started at on McLean, where that sort of became a part of the studio rhythm as well. What are some other things that you do to maintain that?
Well, I do write a lot. I journal, and I pay attention to time. You know, like I pay attention to things that are happening, things that are going on, and documenting what's happening. And like I write a journal, and then every year, I at the end of the year I reread it, and then I highlight some things in it, and then I take those highlights and I put them in this like master document. That's like, it's not really like, it's usually like quotes and things like that. It's kind of a self help sort of thing. And so those are kind of rituals. And then I'm very ritualistic, you know, like, and so I do things that are like daily, and I try to, but the thing that I really do is I have this North Star, or this North, internal compass that's sort of like, you know, and if it goes too far off, and I don't, so I start feeling bad, then I have to go back. And I know that it's all these practices that I do that bring me back. So it's not about if I quote unquote get off track.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's the ability to get back on. It's always the ability to reorient. How do I reorient? Like I can get thrown way off, but then I just like bit by bit by bit, like, you know, for example, I spent the last couple of years playing and singing more than I ever have in my whole life. But then I got the show at Crosstown, and about 6 months ago, my whole focus became on this show in a way that was like, okay, now it's I have to just like this be it for 6 months. Even though I'd made some work for it, it was like really like I could see the calendar and be like, okay, this is just when I'm deep focused for 6 months. And I couldn't really play and sing in the same way, you know? So that engine is cold right now, you know? It's not about, I think the biggest thing that I'm able to do that keeps me on track is I'm willing to pull that old lawnmower out and clean out the carburetor and put it back in together and take that cord and pull it and pull it and pull it. So I'll sit and start from scratch, and just my fingers will get all callousy again. My throat will hurt for a little while, but I'm always willing to get back on. And I think that what happens is, having taught adults art like at Flicker Street and all that, the biggest thing is being like, the only difference between you and me is you had kids, or you had this, or you had a job and you had to put it down, but now you're picking it back up. Is I didn't have to put it down, and when I did put it down, I was always having a willingness to pick it back up.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's probably a good place to pause.
Have we talked for 2 hours?
No, it's pretty close. It's an hour and 48 minutes. Let's see. And that was the second of two interviews done with Melissa Dunn. This interview was recorded on March 8th, 2024. We'll be back next week with another interview. Until then, thank you for listening.